I had to readjust my wire on my mic here. It had gotten bent and it was trying to get into my mouth there. These things aren't meant for people who have attached earlobes, see. They're meant for you to have an unattached earlobe so to slide up underneath there. And the guy that was kind of the Courtney Ray Tucker Pounds out at Bear Valley, he used to always say, well, I can get my pocket knife and I can make a little slit there for you. And they wonder why I moved back to Tennessee, you know. Well, good evening. It's good to see everybody out this evening. We are still in our study of the Gospel of Mark and hope that you'll turn to the Gospel of Mark. And chapter 14 is where we are studying from this evening. And we're going to pick up where we left off last week. You remember that Jesus was in the garden in the last week praying. And I mentioned the fact, and we'll notice a few examples this evening that will talk about that a little bit more. But I mentioned the fact last week that James is being very specific and focused in what he gives us when it comes to the arrest, trial, and ultimately the crucifixion of Jesus, particularly during this chapter 14 of the arrest and trial of Jesus, that the theme that we've been looking at through Mark all along is our need to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Him. Are we going to allow Him to be king, or are we going to try to king ourselves? Well, we see a great example, a contrast of that in Jesus and Peter. You recall that last week we looked at Peter in that upper room scene when they're partaking of the Passover, and he tells Jesus that even if everybody else denies you, even if it means putting to death, I will never forsake you. And Jesus told him that he would deny him 3 times, and we talked about how that Peter was one who was willing to follow the Lord from a mental standpoint, but when push come to shove, he went into self-preservation mode. Remember, Jesus told them that the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Well, he wanted to follow. He wanted to let him be Lord, but when push come to shove, he wasn't willing to deny himself. Jesus, on the other hand, you recall in the Garden of Gethsemane, prayed 3 times, so let this cup pass from me. If there's any other way we can get this done, let's do it that way. He was not willing to do what God wanted him to do, what he knew he was going to have to do before the very foundation of the earth. But as a human, Jesus is now faced with this, and I don't want to go through that pain. I don't want to go through that hurt. I don't want to go through crucifixion. But ultimately, he's willing to submit to the Lord. And that's when submission really takes place, is when we don't want to do something. But you've got Peter who wants to follow but doesn't, and then you have Jesus who doesn't want to follow but does. And we talked about that contradiction, and we'll see it play out a little bit more this evening as we go through our text. So we're going to start tonight in verse 43 and see how far we can get, hopefully, towards the end of chapter 14. But all of this is material that you'll find in Matthew, Luke, and John. We talked about last week, though, that there's going to be obvious things that Mark leaves out, and we will tend to want to run to the other Gospels to fill in the gaps. And I do believe that there's a time and a place to have those kind of studies where we put it all together and get the full picture of what happens. But while we're studying Mark, I think it's important for us to look at it and say, why did Mark leave those details out? Why did he say it this way instead of that way? And again, I think the point that we'll try to keep hammering is that he's making a contrast here between Peter and Jesus and their willingness to deny self and follow the Lord. So we have verses 43 through 45 where we left off last week. Judas betraying Jesus, it says immediately. And immediately, you remember, Jesus comes back out to his disciples that last time and finds them sleeping. And then he says, it is enough. And we talked about last week, the it is enough, I believe, is him saying it's enough asking for God to change his mind, because he's looking and seeing the crowd coming toward him. He's got his answer, and his answer is no. We're not going to do it a different way. This is the cup that he must drink of that he talked about earlier. And so immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12. Now, Mark points that out here because you'll recall that in the supper, it was never identified in Mark's gospel. He never identified who it was. They had this conversation about how that one of you is going to deny me, but Mark never in the supper scene identified that it was Judas rather. And so here he's saying, here comes Judas with the group, because Judas was one of the 12, and he's the one that Jesus was speaking of earlier. And with him a crowd with swords and clubs. Now, why would they be bringing swords and clubs? Well, just like the disciples, everyone else was thinking when they thought about the Messiah, they're thinking this is an anointed king who's going to start a revolution with the Romans, and we need to be ready for a battle. That's the way typically this would happen when you would have, and there were many guys, especially during this time of year, the Passover, that would say, I'm the Messiah, and lead a revolt that the Romans would have to put down. And then at the end of that verse, you notice that he talks about that with them, these guys are coming from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And I'm going to try to help you notice that as we keep going through. All of those suffering statements like 8:31 and 9:31 and 10:34 through 35, which is kind of the main, but there's been several of these suffering statements. And we've talked about how that's been Mark's focus with all of these, is the fact that this suffering that Jesus is going to have to go through is coming. Who's behind it all are these religious leaders, which brings us all the way back to chapter 12. You remember the parable in which you've got the tenants of the vineyard that they think, well, if we kill the son, then we will inherit the vineyard. Well, these are the tenants. These are the ones that have been put in charge of the Father's vineyard, and they have this idea that if we kill the son, we get to inherit the kingdom, get to inherit the vineyard. And they recognize that Jesus was talking about them, and this is going to play out that that's what they're going to specifically try to do. So in verse 44 and 45, now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, the one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard. Sometimes people will ask, well, why did they have to ID Jesus? Why did he have to identify Jesus if Jesus was as famous as he was at that point? And he was famous, but one of the other things about Jesus, you know, when you're watching a Jesus movie or a Jesus television show like The Chosen, Jesus is always the most, the best looking. His hair is flowing just properly, and he's the best at. Well, that wasn't the way it really was with Jesus. There was nothing about him, his appearance, that made you say, man, that must be the star of the show. So you've got that. You've got the fact that it's at night. You've got the fact that they're out in this in this garden rather, and they're going to come up suddenly and try to take him. And we want to make sure we get the right guy. We want to make sure we get the leader, because if we get the leader, then that'll be the end of the revolt here. So some of those kind of things probably factor into it. But when he came, he went up to him, that's Judas, at once and said, Rabbi, he calls him teacher. Had he been learning from him? Not too well, huh? Rabbi, and he kissed him. Now, what's interesting is, of course, that this word that's translated kiss comes from, you know, we've talked about before that there's different words in the Greek language for love. Well, this is the Greek word that means brotherly love. It's similar to the beginning. It's where actually the city of brother love, Philadelphia, gets its name from. So this is a brotherly love kiss. The way that Judas betrays him is with a brotherly love kiss. And you just have to imagine how much that hurt Jesus for it to be done in that way. And at this point, verse 45, that's all we have about Judas. That's the end of what Mark tells us about Judas. He doesn't tell us about Judas repenting of it, being sad about what he had done. He doesn't tell us about him going back and throwing the money in. He doesn't tell us about him going out and hanging himself, because none of that fit in with the point that Mark is trying to make. It's not that it wasn't true. It's just that again, Mark is trying to make this contrast between Jesus, who was not willing but submitted, and Peter, who was willing but then didn't submit. And so all of this extra material about Judas isn't constructive towards that point. And so then after he's identified him, that's the last we'll hear about Judas, and now Jesus is going to be arrested and the disciples are going to run off. It says they laid hands on him and seized him, but one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now, again, that's Peter that did that, but Mark doesn't tell us that because, again, it's not necessary. And he doesn't also tell us, Mark doesn't, about the fact that Jesus took the ear and put it back on the man and performed this miracle. Remember, the way that Mark's laid out his account of Jesus is he front-loaded the first half of the gospel with all the miracles to prove who the Messiah was, that Jesus was the Messiah. And in the second half, he doesn't try to prove that he's the Messiah. He's trying to prove what it means to be the Messiah. So no miracle performed here because Mark has already showed us enough miracles to tell us that Jesus is God the Son. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me?" Well, the answer to that is yes. 49, day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but let the Scriptures be fulfilled. So Jesus says, why did you come out like I've got an army out here ready to fight? Every day I've been in the temple. Every day, what have I been doing? I haven't been sword fighting. I haven't been fist fighting. I've been teaching over and over again. And at any point that you wanted, you could have come and arrested me in broad daylight with everybody around when I'm just sitting there teaching. But you didn't do that. Well, why didn't they do that? If you write in your Bible, and I hope you do, draw a line up, or at least write out beside this verse, chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, because remember 14, 1 and 2 talks about how that they were trying to figure out a way that they could arrest Jesus and bring him in, but they were afraid of how they were going to do it because they didn't want to start a riot. That's why they didn't go in broad daylight in front of everybody and arrest him, because this is the same city that had welcomed him in a few days before, throwing palm branches and coats out in front of him and saying, "Hail the King of the Jews." So what if they'd have tried to go and arrest him? What would have happened? There would have been this big revolt, right? There would have been a big riot. There would have been bloodshed and problems, and that was one of the things that they were scared about because they were afraid that the Romans would come in and take away their power and position and take away their country as well. He says, "But let the Scriptures be fulfilled." And it's hard to know exactly what Scriptures that he's talking about. I've got a few up there on the screen that is maybe some of the ones that he's referring to. Chapter 9 and verse 12, and already in this chapter, verse 18, verse 21. Verse 27 is basically his rewording, Zechariah 13 and verse 7. Isaiah 53 talks about the fact that he'll be taken as a lamb to the slaughter. He won't open his mouth or say a word. He calls himself the Son of Man previously, and later on in this text he's going to. So that's a reference back to Daniel chapter 7. So the Scriptures be fulfilled. Maybe it's all of these that he's talking about, but nonetheless, he is what's going on here is you think you're in control. You think that all of this is happening because you're in control of this situation, but what's happening here is that God's will, that He's prophesied from the very beginning, that's coming to pass. Now, the Jews knew about a lot of the messianic prophecies that were in the Old Testament, but there were a lot of them that they just, like Isaiah 53, that they just overlooked because that didn't fit the preconceived idea of who the Messiah was going to be. And so Jesus says, you think you're in control, but really God is in control, and all of this is happening according to His will. And so verse 50 says, and they all left Him and fled. And the all here is the disciples. The 11 that were left and the others that had been following Him, that were out in that garden, they all ran off. And this, I'm not even showing you that, am I? Let me try to do it this way. There we go. They all left him and fled. And the reason that I've got up there, that's a wow verse, because again, Mark makes the point that Peter said, even if everybody else leaves you, I'm not going to. Mark made the point that Peter said, even if it means dying, that I want to. But remember, Mark also said that all the rest of the 11 said the same thing. Peter's the example that he's using to contrast with Jesus. But all of these that were there that said, I'll follow you no matter what, now they've all run away just like Jesus said they would back in verse 27 of chapter 14. So that's a wow verse to me. Well, why did they flee? Well, we're going to see something in the next few verses, I think, that clarifies that. But the reason why is because if they've captured Jesus, remember, I'm willing to follow Jesus as Messiah. I'm willing to follow Him as the King that's going to lead us to throwing the Romans out. We're going to be a mighty nation once again. I'm going to be part of the inner cabinet, the inner circle. I'm more than willing to follow Jesus when Jesus is what I want Him to be. But when He voluntarily gives Himself up, am I willing to follow Jesus when Jesus goes against what I want? It's amazing how many times that you'll have people that this is what the Bible teaches about marriage, divorce, remarriage. Until my son or daughter gets divorced. And then we ought to restudy that. And I've never seen them restudy it and come back and say, you know, we were teaching the right thing all along. There's a change. Or this is what the Bible says about women's role. Until I have 3 talented daughters, and then we say, well, we need to restudy that. Or this is what the Bible says about whatever, the plan of salvation, or you know, whatever it might be, until it affects me. Are we willing to follow Jesus whenever He goes a different direction than what I want Him to go? See, again, submission, and that's what He's talking about when He says, deny self. That's submission. Deny self, take up your cross, put yourself to death, and follow me. Submission doesn't happen when things are going the way I want it to. Some of you may or may not know we have elders, ministers meetings pretty much every Wednesday night after services. If we go into our meeting tonight and the elders say, Corey, we've been talking about it, we're going to give you a 50% raise. Then I'll submit since y'all want to, you know. Not a lot of submission involved there, right? What if I go in and they say, Corey, the budget is tight and we're going to have to cut your pay 20%. That's when submission comes in. When it's not going the direction that I want to. Now, Johnny, just forget everything you heard in the last 30 seconds, okay? So, we don't want him getting any ideas. I'm not willing to follow this Jesus that's going to give Himself up and not head the same direction that I am, because it might mean that but Jesus had told him all along, this is what's going to happen to me. And how many times in storms at seas and with demons attacking and everything else had Jesus taken care of the disciples? Why not trust? Remember, that's what we talked about last week with Jesus. It is enough. I'm done asking Him to change His mind because He's given me my answers. Now I've just got to trust that He's going to carry me through it. And they weren't willing to do that. And then the next couple of verses is maybe the most strange couple of verses in all of the Gospel of Mark. There's this young man who is not identified in the Bible anywhere, but a young man followed Him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, and he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. So evidently there was a young man that was there, and he had kind of like a toga thing going on, and they grabbed the toga, and he took off running, and the toga fell off, and he runs off naked. If you're ever in preaching school, you don't want to get these two verses for your senior sermon that you have to preach on, okay? Hard to make some application here. And so it's a weird couple of verses to put in there. Now, if you go to commentaries, most of them will tell you that this is Mark, and maybe it is. We talked about in the introduction of this book about the close connection that Mark and his family had with Peter. We've talked about repeatedly that this is sometimes called Peter's gospel because it's very much from Peter's perspective and whatnot, but there's nothing in here that would indicate that this is really Mark. Some commentaries you go to, they will tell you this long, elaborate story about Mark and what he was doing there and how this happened and what happened afterwards. None of that's in the Bible, so where they're getting all that from, I'm not sure, but nonetheless, I think really the point of him having these two verses in here is to help us understand verse 50 of why they fled. Because they didn't just try to arrest Jesus. They tried to grab anybody else that was there with him, including this young man. And thankfully, he had on a toga and not spandex that night or something, but it didn't hold on to his body, but it kind of shows why it was that the disciples took off running, is because they were trying to get all that they could, not just Jesus. So then in verse 53, beginning, we have Jesus before the high priest, which is the beginning of what Jesus is going to have to go through as far as a trial is concerned. It says they led Jesus to the high priest, and I've got this underlined because remember who in the suffering statements Jesus said it was that was behind what was going to happen to him. Now, let me pause here, and I'm going to keep saying that. But make no mistake about it, you remember when Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, came out a few years ago, and there was this big debate. Did the Jews kill Jesus, or did the Romans kill Jesus? And I try to tell everybody then, I can end the debate. I can tell you exactly who killed Jesus, and that's Corey Sawyers. Because it was because of my sins that he went to the cross. The Jews nor the Romans could have killed Jesus unless he was willing to go and die for me. And we'll point that out very specifically here in just a few minutes. But we sometimes will sing, he could have called 10,000 angels to destroy the world and set him free. The Bible actually says he could have called way more than 10,000 angels. But nonetheless, I think if he had called one angel, that would have probably been enough to have taken care of the problem there, much less 10,000 or even more. But he didn't. But still, this is all pointing us back to that chapter 12 parable of these are the tenants that think if we kill the son, then we can inherit the vineyard. So they led him to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. This is the religious leaders that would have been involved in wanting to take Jesus down. Now, one of the arguments that the Pharisees will eventually make is the fact that if this was the Messiah, then one of us would have believed in him, and none of us believe in him. Is it true that none of the Pharisees believed in Jesus? It's not true. Who was it that believed in him? Nicodemus. And if you have watched The Chosen, every time I think, that's Nicodemus in my mind now, that actor that played him. And presumably there would have been some more, you would think at least, of these religious leaders. We've had, rulers of the synagogue, and we've had Pharisees, and we've had scribes, and we've had others that have recognized Jesus' authority and his power and wanted him to do miracles for him. So this would have been a collection of just these ones who are willing to kill the son in order to inherit the vineyard. And Peter had followed him at a distance. You're going to notice how he flips back and forth here the rest of this chapter. He'll talk a little bit about Peter, then he'll talk a little bit about Jesus, then he'll talk a little bit about Peter, then he'll talk a little bit about Jesus. And here's that contrast. Peter starts off by fleeing. He says, I'm going to follow you no matter what, but then he flees in the garden scene, and he doesn't. And now we've got him following, but he's following from a distance. I don't want to be too closely associated with Jesus. He followed him a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. In fact, when we study John in the fall, you kind of get the notion that John's basically dragging him into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. This could have been even some of the arresting officers that went out into the garden and arrested Jesus. So I would imagine that he had his head down and was trying to conceal himself as much as possible. Now the chief priests, there's that word again, and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death. They are going around looking for people who will testify something against Jesus that will give us the reason to put him to death. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a minute. When the Sanhedrin Council was taking on trying a death case, their job was actually to try to find someone who would defend the person who's on trial. In other words, we don't go into this assuming that he's guilty. We go into this like our judicial system is supposed to be, assuming that he's innocent until someone can prove him guilty. But they're not trying to find someone who will justify his innocence. They're trying to find anybody that will say anything against him that will give us a reason to put him to death. And you almost get the picture here, seeking testimony. It doesn't say we're seeking testimony in the matter of he was blaspheming or he was defiling the temple or he was whatever. We don't really have a charge. We've just got a sentence, and we need a charge that lines up with that sentence. So anybody got anything? And one of the reasons I think that's kind of what was going on is because they end up changing the charge against Jesus midstream. So they're looking for these people that will testify against him. But notice that last line in verse 55, but they found none. And that's the key to this verse, and these two verses actually, is that they found no one who could testify against Jesus. Why was that? Because he's innocent. That's what that last line is really meaning. Not that they couldn't find anybody because they were few and far between, not because they couldn't find anybody because they didn't work hard enough at it, because they really wanted him dead. The reason they couldn't find anybody is because there was nobody. And then it says in verse 56, for many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. Yo, Vinny, you need someone to testify? It's almost like a mobster movie here, you know. I'll make up some charges. I hope I didn't offend anybody named Vinny that might be watching tonight, but that felt right in the line for some reason. I don't know. We'll make up some charges, and one of the reasons why you know they're making up charges is because they couldn't agree on which charge it was that they were going to testify about, that this false testimony that they were giving. Now, this is a little bit of a side, and I don't know how much of my sloppy handwriting you can read, but when you think about the trial and crucifixion of Jesus, it ought to break our hearts, and every time we think about it, Sunday morning when we're taking the Lord's Supper or any other time during the week we think about it, that we study about it, it ought to break our hearts and it ought to bring tears to our eyes. Mainly because, as I said a few minutes ago, it was because of me that God the Son died. That I'm the one that put him on that cross. And I know that he's innocent, and I know that he didn't deserve it. But one of the things that really ought to affect us as we read about it, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this or studied about this before, but just how illegal the arrest and trial and crucifixion of Jesus was. So, let me give you some for examples. It was illegal because he was arrested illegally. And some of these are laws of Moses that they were commanded by God. Some of these were their laws that they had put in the Mishnah. He was arrested illegally because it was against the law for anyone who was prejudiced against someone to arrest someone. In other words, if I had stolen all of Jeff's livestock, Jeff couldn't come arrest me. Jeff would have to get, Ron Ayers or somebody who was impartial in the case to come arrest me. It was an illegal arrest because there was no opportunity given to Jesus to defend himself. When they came to arrest someone, they had to say, here's what you're being charged with. What do you have to say for yourself? They never gave Jesus that opportunity. They arrested him with no formal charge. You remember in the garden, they just grabbed him and took him. And then they tried to figure out what to charge him with. They arrested him at night secretly, which was against the law for them to do. They arrested him based on Judas, and that was the only, at that point, witness that they had. But Judas could not be an accepted witness because Judas was a criminal at this point. He had taken a bribe, which made him a criminal. And the testimony of a criminal was not allowed to be charged for arrest. So he was arrested illegally, but there's several reasons why it was an illegal arrest. Number two, it was illegal because there was a capital examination at night, which was not allowed. John chapter 18 and John chapter 19 point that out, that it's a night arrest, a night examination where they brought him before the court to try him in a capital case, and that was not supposed to be done. The reason why is because most everybody's at home in bed at night, and we don't want to kill somebody unless they deserve to be killed. I mean, I throw them in prison, and then we find out, we messed up, well, we can let him out. I've always thought that when that happens, you ought to get like a free, do something wrong, maybe speed a little bit more, and they don't give you a ticket or something. But if we put you to death, we can't reverse that one. So we're going to do it in the daytime so that everybody hears about it, and anybody that can defend him will be there. Well, that's the very reason why they did it at night as they did. Number three, it was illegal because they had unprovable charges. They tried to find someone that would testify against him, and they couldn't prove that he had done any of the things that they said. Number four, they had a trial held before sunrise. So they actually heard the case, and then they had the trial for him before the sun rose, which was also illegal. Number five, the Sanhedrin convened illegally. This was the day before an annual Sabbath, and they could not convene on a capital case the day before an annual Sabbath, because what they were supposed to do is the Sanhedrin meet, they would hear a capital case, and on that day, they wouldn't render a verdict. They'd go home and sleep on it, we would say, and make sure, process, think it through, and come back the next day. And then after we've thought it through, then we feel good about saying that he's going to be put to death. But you didn't do that the day before Sabbath because there'd be no convening the next day because it's Sabbath. So if Friday is when all of this would start, well, we're just going to wait and start this up on Sunday when we have 2 days back-to-back we can meet, but that's not what they did. Trial concluded in one day. Again, that's because of what I just suggested is illegal. They used false witnesses, which we just noticed in verses 55 through 59, that they're using false witnesses, which made it illegal. They did not hear a defense. They asked Jesus these questions. Jesus didn't answer, and then they immediately say he's guilty. Those who would have voted against are absent. You would have to think that Nicodemus, some of these others that would have been on the council that maybe had either a belief in Jesus or were a little bit skeptical of what was going on here, weren't there. Again, one of the reasons why you do it at night, to not have those people there. No, there was no one-by-one vote. So what would happen is we bring Danny Cash in before the Sanhedrin, and we lay out the case, and the next day, what we do is we don't say all for killing him, say aye. All opposed say, we would go one by one through everyone. We'd say, Matt, how do you vote? And Matt is put on the spot to say, we're going to kill him. Ron, how do you vote? We're going to kill him. Alan, how do you vote? Each one. And in fact, what they're supposed to do is when we call on Matt, each and every person of the Sanhedrin is supposed to defend Danny. Even though you're his jury that's trying him, when I call on Matt, Matt's going to say, well, Danny's a good man. I've known him all my life. It's hard for me to believe that, and you're going to give every reason why you would defend his honor. And then you would vote however you wanted to. That didn't happen. What's going to happen here in just a minute is the high priest is going to say, haven't you heard enough? What do we do? And they all start shouting and they carry him off. The council itself was illegal, not only because it was at night, but because they had, most scholars would count at least 12 at this point former high priests, and you were supposed to serve as high priest until you died, but we'd already talked about how that they'd messed up that system. The high priest is going to tear his robe in just a minute. When Jesus says what he says, he's going to tear his robe, which was against Mosaic law. It's just crazy to me to think about. They're going to drum up charges against Jesus to kill him, but notice how many of their laws that they're willing to break to kill Jesus, and even Mosaical laws. Leviticus 21 and verse 10 and Leviticus 10 and verse 6. This was something that the high priest was not to do. In fact, the high priest, who is the head of the council, is the one person who's supposed to, at all times, remain under control. He's like the judge that's, if everybody else is losing their mind, he's the one that's staying even-keeled and saying, all right, let's not make an emotional decision. Let's calm down and think about this logically. And he's inciting an emotional decision by tearing his robe. He was sentenced in the wrong place. Luke 22:54, they're at the high priest's residence when they came together to sentence him. And they're only supposed to be able to sentence people there at the house where the Sanhedrin council meets. His charges were changed. I mentioned that a few minutes ago. In John chapter 18 and 19, you'll see how they changed specifically how they did. We'll note it here in Mark when we get to it. That's 13. There's actually over 40 different laws of Moses and different laws of theirs that they had made in the Mishnah. 40 plus laws that they broke in order to crucify Jesus. Do you remember how many times that the scribes or the chief priests or whoever would come to Jesus in order to trick him? We got the perfect question. What's the greatest commandment? And Jesus got all nervous and he said, I don't know what to say, right? Jesus knew what was in their heart, and he put them on the spot, and he made them look bad. You know the commands. What does it say? Well, love your neighbor as yourself, and love your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And Jesus says, that's right. So I need to justify myself. What can I ask? Well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus said, man, that's a tough one. I don't know how to answer that. That's not what he said, is it? He told this story, this parable, and showed everyone who was the master teacher. With all of that in the background of what we know about how Jesus could interact with people, number one, let me ask you this question. Do you think that Jesus knew that they were breaking all these laws? He knew, didn't he? Do you think that if Jesus had tried just a little bit to defend himself, that he could have pulled a Ben Matlock or a Perry Mason out of the hat easily and got this thrown out? I mean, think about, there's not one little mess up, over 40 mess ups. But he didn't. Maybe that's why he didn't open his mouth to defend himself, because he knew this was the cup that he had to drink of. I have no doubt that he could have easily said, I object, Your Honor, and brought up any one of these stipulations and said, this is illegal. And maybe they would have said, well, we don't care about that. And then he starts enumerating number 2, number 3, number 4, number 37, number 38, number 39, and somebody would have had to have said, I guess he's right, we'll try again next week. But he didn't. Why? It is enough. Peter said, I'm willing to follow. But he fled, and he's following at a distance because he wasn't really at the point that he was willing to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow the Lord. Jesus says, I'm not willing, but you've given me the answer. That's enough. Corey needs a sacrifice, so I'm going to do it because that's what the Father wants, and that's what Corey needs. So again, as we talked about last week in our ending, we need to ask ourselves the question, which one of those attitudes are we willing to express, not only to our Lord, but to each other? Are we willing to look at what God has told us to do and say, I don't really want to do that, but I'm going to deny myself, take up my cross, and follow Him? To look at what each other needs and say, yes, that inconveniences me, or yes, maybe that puts me in an uncomfortable situation, but I know that's what he or she needs. I'm going to deny self, take up my cross, and follow Jesus because it's what they need me to do. We talk sometimes about following Jesus and how important that is, but here's where the rubber meets the road. When it gets tough, what are we going to do? Well, we'll begin with verse 57 next week. We didn't get through with chapter 14, and I've got on here, please read chapter 15, verses 1 through 21. But I actually start there where we left off with the false testimony with Jesus in chapter 14, and then we'll work our way into chapter 15 hopefully next week. Before we dismiss, have a few announcements.